So tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Selwyn from the University of Sussex. He's a visiting fellow with ANCLIS for a few weeks. This is one of two seminars, public lectures that he'll be doing, and what he's particularly interested in is what is termed elite-centred development theory, of which I suppose you could say is the mainstream in the development field, in the major institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the aid agencies, and so on. And tonight he's going to challenge that theory and critique it and propose a labour-centred alternative. So without going into any of those details, about which I know very little, I have to confess, I'm just going to introduce Ben to you. He'll speak, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion, and as I said, informal discussion after the meeting. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Thank you very much for having me. I really want to thank John for enabling me to come here. It's my first time in Australia. Always wanted to come here, but it's such a long way. So thank you very much to John and to ANCLIS. So basically the aim of this talk, what I'm going to do in the next half an hour or so, is to basically illuminate the two-faced nature of development discourse. Whenever you look at politicians on the TV or the leaders of the World Bank or anyone involved in development, they're always nice people. They're good people. They want the world to be a better place. You get this warm feeling of, these are my friends. We're all in the same boat. We really want to make the world a better place. You get a positive feel from them. And that's how development is portrayed. I'm going to reveal that or claim that is completely two-faced. And behind that face, there is another much more sinister face. And next week, I will speak on the subject of labour-centred development in Latin America. So I'll go very much more into a exposition of what the alternative is. So this week is very much more a critique. Next week is the alternative, although we'll speak a little bit about the alternative here. In doing this critique, I'm going to focus on three core traditions in development theory: neoliberalism, which we all know, statism, and also, surprisingly perhaps, one strand of Marxism. Before I get to that, let's just start then with the benign face. The Sustainable Development Goals are, I suppose, the most articulate form of this benign face of development. When you look at these goals, they are fantastic. Goal number one, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Not one person in the world could disagree with that. And this follows the claims made by the leaders of the Millennium Development Goals that the MDG number one, which was to halve poverty between at the $1.25 a day level, halve that poverty between 1990 and 2015, was achieved by 2010, 5 years early, and so we're moving in the right direction. Other goals of the SDGs are end hunger, achieve food security, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all, promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all, reduce inequality within and amongst countries, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. All of these things, as I've said, are worthy and absolutely necessary. And development, the discourse that is propounded by a whole range of institutions and actors, is about uplifting and empowering the world's poor. That's why we're all in it together, and they're the good guys doing the rest of the world, doing real work for the rest of the world to make the world a better place. And when you read their publications, they claim that they are succeeding. Globalization is good for the poor. That's what the World Bank says, and all their statistics prove it. And even when they make mistakes, like Chen and Ravalion did in 2008, when they miscalculated poverty trends by around 200 million, they say, okay, but we're still moving in the right direction. I mean, I'm not an economist, but any economist or mathematician getting that kind of level of error, I think, would not just get a C+, but would probably get a fail in their exam. But nevertheless, we're all moving in the right direction. Now, what I want to argue is that this is two-faced. Beyond that, it's actually something very sinister and something akin to what George Orwell wrote about in his novel 1984. In that novel, he described this dystopian future, which was one of perpetual war, total government surveillance, and infinite public manipulation. And Winston, the main character in the novel, he describes doublethink, which is the form that the state uses to manipulate the public's minds, the proles' minds, as follows. To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them. I mean, Orwell was writing in 1948. This is comparable to what Gramsci was writing about when he was talking about hegemonic ideas and so on, and it's equivalent in many ways to what Foucault was writing about when he was talking about discourse construction. It's about presenting the world in a particular way that forces others to see the world in the way that you want them to see it in order to justify your position in a power structure which is hidden by your language. Now, mainstream development discourse is a form of doublethink in at least three ways. First of all, the international poverty line, which was devised by people like Martin Ravalion and the World Bank and used by the United Nations to calculate extreme poverty. It went from $1 a day to $1.08 to $1.25, now $1.90. It is way too low. It is inhumanly low. And this is not just an error. This is a huge scientific endeavor went into enabling purchasing parity analysis across the world. I mean, this is not a simple endeavor, and yet it is inhumanly low. So, for example, Peter Edward, in an influential article from 2006 on the idea of the ethical poverty line, which for him is higher, he says that in the mid-2000s, the poverty line that the World Bank held to was equivalent, after allowing for inflation, to living in the United States with just $1.30 to spend each day to meet all of your survival needs. Now, if you go to the US, you know there is no way anyone could survive on $1.30 a day. It's impossible. So why is the poverty line so low? I mean, there's a lot of other evidence that shows it's way too low. It needs to be higher. But of course, if you raise the poverty line, then the conclusion that the World Bank comes to again and again, that globalization is good for the poor, that the numbers of the world's poor are falling consistently, that we are in a position of having less than 10% of the world's population in a state of poverty, that falls apart. And something else much more sinister is revealed, where we see that actually the majority of the world's population live in one form or other of poverty. Secondly, the development discourse argues that global poverty reduction is best pursued through rapid economic growth, and it completely discounts any other form of achieving poverty reduction. It poo-poos again and again the idea of distributive-based poverty reduction. Distribution is completely marginal. Economic growth is absolutely central. But the essence of this argument, that economic growth is key to achieving poverty reduction, is basically to say that the rich, those who benefit mostly from growth, have to get much, much, much richer for the poor to get a little bit less poor. That is the logic of a growth-based approach to poverty reduction. And of course, growth-based poverty reduction ignores completely the way that the growth over the last 30 years, or actually since the emergence of capitalism, has benefited the top echelons of society. So, for example, by 2013, the richest 1% of the world controlled $110 trillion, or 65 times the total wealth of the poorest 3.5 billion. People like David Woodward, who's a very important economist, works for the New Economics Foundation, works for UNCTAD. He's written a brilliant paper in the World Economic Review, and it shows that the benefits from growth have accrued, not surprisingly, to those in the upper percentages of the world's elite, and those in the bottom decile, even the bottom 40% or 50%, have really not benefited from massive amounts of growth over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, the third way that the development ideology represents a form of doublethink, remember, they're talking about helping the poor, uplifting the poor, and so on, is that when the poor, in inverted commas, try to uplift themselves, to help themselves, to empower themselves, if they're not doing so in the ways that the development ideology thinks is correct, then the development ideology, backed up by those institutions, feels it in their responsibility to legitimate attacking those poor and putting them back into containers of development discourse and practice. So when the poor try and uplift themselves, the response by the development institutions is to either ignore those attempts or to actually repress them and exploit them. So the core of my argument is basically that whilst the mainstream development theory, practice, policy aims for the uplifting of the world's poor, many of the traditions founded within development theory is founded upon assumptions about the poor which actually contribute to the continual impoverishment and repression and exploitation of the poor themselves. Not only that, it's done so in the name of the poor. The poor are repressed and exploited for their own good. This is what I call an elite subject, subordinate object conception of development. And it reproduces itself in a number of ways. It defines the elites, whether they are state actors, state bureaucrats, non-governmental organisations, corporations, international institutions. The elites are the drivers of development. It ignores and delegitimates the actions of the poor to ameliorate their conditions. A consequence of the previous point is that it legitimates elite exploitation and repression of the poor, politically and economically, especially if the poor contest the elite vision and practice of development. And finally, whilst there are many actions by the poor that are actually developmental, and that's what I want to argue very much towards the end of this lecture and in the next one, these are ignored in mainstream development discourse, and actually they are presented as hindrances to achieving development. So in all of these ways, you have doublethink and you have the reproduction of an elite subject-subordinate object relationship. Now in their brilliant book, Doctrines of Development, Michael Cowan and Roger Shenton talk about this in one way. And they say that development is basically a doctrine because it rests upon, and I quote, the intent to develop through the exercise of trusteeship over society. Trusteeship is the intent which is expressed by one source of agency to develop the capacities of another. Or to put it differently, elite subjects have got primary agency within their vision of the world. Subordinate objects only have secondary agency once they play along with the predetermined conceptions of development designed and implemented by the elite subjects. And this way of thinking about development is immensely demobilizing for the world's poor. An example of that is how the United Nations Millennium Goals Director, Jeffrey Sachs, a friend of Bono, good guy, talking about ending poverty in the future, he says the following. He says that people like you, perhaps, who protest against the sweatshops in parts of Asia that make cheap clothes, you're completely wrong, and you should be celebrating those sweatshops, because those sweatshops, and to quote him, the sweatshops are the first rung on the ladder out of extreme poverty. He sees these sweatshops as emancipatory, as liberating, as forms of development. And the only way he can say that is because, it is true, many of these sweatshops, the workers get paid more than the equivalent of $1 or $1.25 a day. And so by definition, they are being lifted out of poverty if they weren't earning that before. But if you have a more humane poverty line, then actually, even on that limited money metric way of thinking about poverty, these workers are working very long hours under very repressive conditions and are experiencing poverty pay. And this explains the very long hours and the unpaid overtime or the extra overtime that many of these workers have to do just in order to get by, and the extra jobs that they need to take. But he's saying we should celebrate these achievements. Gustavo Esteva, from a post-development, post-structuralist perspective, he talks about the debilitating effects of the way the development discourse has been framed and the effects it has on the poor themselves. He says, for the world's poor to think of any kind of development requires first the perception of themselves as underdeveloped what that really means is I'm an underdeveloped little person, and this great, big, developed person is going to show me the way forward. That idea is part and parcel of capitalist history, going back to colonial times, the white man's burden, racism, and so on. So how do these ways of thinking about the world, the elite subject, subordinate object, the doublethink, how do they play out in these three traditions that I've mentioned, neoliberalism, statism, and some forms of Marxism? If we look at neoliberalism, it's based on three core axioms that we're all familiar with. Specialization, from Adam Smith, the idea that specialization in one branch of industry can actually lead to productivity gains. And if you read the literature, it's very focused on productivity gains. The second area of productivity gains can be achieved through comparative advantage, another form of specialization, but kind of theorized very much better by Ricardo. And thirdly, the third area, third axiom, is the idea of eliminating market inflexibilities. The idea of the market inflexibilities, market imperfections. And this comes from neoclassical economics, around 100 years after Smith. Now, the idea in all of this is that the market is this, the invisible hand, has got this immense force and ability to direct resources in such a way that will lead to incorporation of the world's poor, lead to productivity increases, ameliorate poverty, and so on. But what about the problem of market inflexibilities? I mean, this is an argument that says markets can do these things, but they can't do so if they are made inflexible or made rigid. And it is a job of the international institutions and the state actors to rid the market of these inflexibilities. Now, Robert Solow defined what a market inflexibility is in relation to the labour market. And here we get a very good taste of what the doublethink and what the elite subject, subordinate object really comes down to when we're talking about neoliberal conceptions of development. So he says, and I quote, "A labour market is inflexible if the level of unemployment insurance benefits is too high or their duration is too long, or if there are too many restrictions on the freedom of employers to fire and to hire, or if the permissible hours of work are too tightly regulated, or if excessively generous compensation for overtime work is mandated, or if trade unions have too much power to protect incumbent workers against competition and to control the flow of work at the site of production, or perhaps if statutory health and safety regulations are too stringent." Basically, anything that is good for workers is a labour market inflexibility. Now, they don't stand there and say, we hate workers. They say, we love workers, and this is what we want. This is why we want to get rid of the inflexibilities. Because, to quote Anne Kruger, who is the chief economist at the World Bank between 1982 and 86, with a sufficiently low urban wage, a zero employment level is a feasible outcome. We can have full employment if only we rid the market of the inflexibilities which are caused by trade unions, which push wages up, which dissuade capitalists to invest and to employ workers. We are on the side of the workers. So in 1993, their report on the East Asian miracle, the World Bank said a similar thing. It said these economies, to quote, have generally been less vulnerable than other developing economy governments to organise labour's demands to legislate a minimum wage. So they talk again and again about how the states in these countries, in the East Asian miracle countries, and corporations have been able to manipulate labour in order to generate high profits, which has benefited labour at the end of the day. Now, neoliberalism is quite pernicious, and most people reject it as some kind of false conception of the market. The market doesn't exist, has never existed, it can never exist as a free market principle the way the neoliberals talk about it. Most people understand it. I mean, everything we talk about when you think about the market, whether it's a labour market, or it's a market for food and land, for money, is very heavily regulated. It's a set of specific social relations. It is not a free market where individuals come and exchange goods under free contracts at all. So most people reject neoliberalism, and most people, when they do that, they turn to the alternative, which they see as statism. They turn to the works of people like Ha-Joon Chang and his Kicking Away the Ladder, which is a very important book, and they say, quite rightly, neoliberalism does not work. We need an alternative. The alternative is to have some form of state intervention in the market. Now, statism goes back to the work of Alexander Hamilton in the United States, and of course Friedrich List. Friedrich List was writing in the early and mid 19th century when Germany was it was not even Germany, when it was a backwater of the English expanding industrial revolution. Friedrich List went to the United States as a free market believer. He saw how the United States capitalists and the state were actually implementing all kinds of policies which today would be called infant industry protection. Tariffs, subsidies to agriculture and to industry, an investment bank, all of these kinds of things. And he took these lessons back with him to Germany, and he wrote up the National System of Political Economy, which was published in the 1840s. And in that, he castigated completely the free market ideology was promoted by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. He said this is just to conflate the national interests of Britain with the cosmopolitan interests of the world, i.e. it's imperialism, it's hypocrisy, and all of the statist political economists today, they can make the same arguments and they win the argument. There's no doubt that the free trade ideology propounded by the WTO, the World Bank and others is a form of free trade imperialism. And this is where the statists get so much of their legitimacy from, because they pretend and they show themselves to be legitimate critics and posing an alternative to the free marketeers of the neoliberal guise. And they've had serious success. I mean, if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, development studies was a very rich and thriving kind of area. You had all kinds of theories. You have dependency theory, world systems theory, Marxism, various forms of statism, and so on. From the 1980s onwards, the neoliberal one-size-fits-all, there is no alternative dogma really crushed many of the alternatives. But statism actually held its ground, and in the 1990s made a real attack on neoliberalism, so much so that the 1993 World Development Report on the Asian Miracle had to acknowledge that the states played a major role. I mean, this was a decisive moment in the World Bank admitting that states play a major role, is emergence of the post-Washington consensus. And so they've got strong intellectual pedigree, they are very empirically based, they make very good arguments. So, surely they're the good guys. Surely they are the ones that we should look to if we want an alternative. Well, no. In fact, they are just simply the reverse of the neoliberals. They say many things opposite in terms of the interaction of states and markets, but when it comes down to the elite subject, subordinate object relationship, that is between a minority of elite planners, of state actors, of corporate owners, and the majority of the population, whether they're workers or peasants, they reproduce neoliberalism's kind of doctrine of development, absolutely. So, for example, Alice Amsden wrote this fantastic book about the emergence of South Korea as an Asian tiger, and she says, to quote her, "High profits in its mass production industries have been derived not merely from investments in machinery and modern work methods, but also from the world's longest working week. Alongside effective investments, cheap labour and labour repression is the basis of late industrialisation everywhere." She recommends it. She's not advocating, but she understands that it exists. Atul Kohli, who's written a book called State-Directed Development and very much promoting the statist political economy variant, he in that book, he compares the South Korea to the interwar European fascist states. And I quote, "These states are generally right-wing authoritarian. They prioritise rapid industrialisation as national goal, are staffed competently, work closely with industrialists, systematically discipline and repress labour, penetrate and control rural society, and use economic nationalism as a tool of political mobilisation." I mean, he is comparing South Korea and Taiwan to maybe not Nazi Germany, but certainly fascist Italy. And the list goes on. I mean, you can read these statists and they all come down to it. They say, of course, we want efficient bureaucrats. We need to have sort of an embedded autonomy. But at the end of the day, they recognise that labour control is absolutely central to their vision of achieving catch-up development. And of course, it is. Now, you'd think, okay, so I reject neoliberalism. I rejected it before I even came to this lecture or before I even came to university, because obviously it's wrong. Now I've thought about statism, I don't particularly like it. What about Marxism? Surely Marxism has got the way to think about the world. Obviously Marxism is not a single ideology or framework. There are many traditions within Marxism. There is the revolutionary proletarian communism from below, but there's also a different type of Marxism which is actually very popular and which permeates a lot of development thinking and a lot of thinking about how we should achieve an alternative world. And this is what I call Modernization Marxism. And Modernization Marxism looks back fondly, in one way or another, whether they admit it or not, to the 5-year plans. They look back fondly to Stalin, and they can say, quite legitimately, look at Stalin. He inherited a country in the late 1920s which was completely destroyed. It had been invaded by imperialist armies, it had a civil war, it had been pushed backwards. And he said, to paraphrase what Stalin said, we are 50 or 100 years behind the West. Either we make do this gap in 5 or 10 years or we are finished. And he did. And that's an extraordinary achievement. Stalin managed to industrialize Soviet Russia at a rate never seen before. He managed to make Russia such a powerful force that it was the main cause of the defeat of the Nazi Germany during the Second World War. This was a major achievement, and many people look back at Stalin, they look at Mao. I mean, the 5-year plans are taken up in India, they're taken up in South Korea even. There's quite a lot of similarity between the statist forms of development and these so-called Marxist forms. And here you have a model of the world which suggests a way forward. Now, they don't really stand up and say we need to go back to Russia, obviously, but in the 1970s they were quite positive about Russia, and there is a lot of this work that still permeates forms of Marxism, and they call themselves Marxists. So, for example, Bill Warren's book, Imperialism, Pioneer of Capitalism, is obviously a play on the words of Lenin's book, but it expresses the progressive aspects of capitalism. And of course, when you read the Communist Manifesto, there are bits in there that Marx has written that no pro-capitalist commentator could supersede. I mean, he talks about capitalism as a dynamic system. Schumpeter recognised that Marx had done a better job of promoting capitalism in that sense than people like Mill or others. Right? So there is some kind of precedent, you could argue, for Marxists thinking about capitalism in progressive ways, but Warren takes it way further. And of course, Marx is not talking about capitalism in progressive ways in order to promote it, because later on in the Communist Manifesto he shifts gear. But anyway, so John Sander and Sheila Smith, in their book Development of Capitalism in Africa, they raise the idea of modernization Marxism to quite a high level. But just to quote them, they say that rapid accumulation in Africa is unlikely to be achieved without significant reductions in the real incomes of a substantial proportion of the population. To achieve such accumulation, African states must become viable political entities, entailing the containing of sub-nationalist pressures through, and I quote, combination of hegemonic official nationalism and the military means to reinforce this ideology. A method must be devised for the appropriation for sufficient surplus to ensure the smooth functioning of the military and repressive apparatus. That's one example from the 1980s or 1990s. Meghna Desai, in his book The Revenge of Marx, I was at a conference with Desai, and he says, I'm a neoliberal, of course I'm a Marxist. He's very casual about this, he's very pro the market. I mean, in his book he talks about how Marx would be on the side of the market. But he says in his book, he recognises that Marx was right about exploitation under capitalism, that capitalists are able to systematically accrue unpaid labour time and unpaid labour from workers. He admits that. But then he says, which is quite shocking, that that relationship is not bad for workers, it's good for workers, and that workers should actually seek to support such a relationship. So just to quote him, if employability depends on high profitability, workers would want to cooperate with employers in keeping profits high. If workers know the rule, no profits, no employment, then they will struggle not for a higher share of the wage in total output, but with a share that maximises their chance of employment. In other words, they will compromise and they will work for the capitalist to make sure the capitalist makes his profits first, or her profits first, and then they will settle for the wage, which enables them to be continually employed there. So this modernisation Marxism exists, and it is pernicious, and it's only because, and you have to ask yourself, how can Marxists and people who sometimes call themselves socialists speak in such ways, and how can they talk about we want a socialist future beyond capitalism whilst also talking about labour repression? Well, they can do that because the academia, or all of the social sciences actually, are formed upon this elite subject subordinate object conception of the world, where the elites do it for the majority and the majority are simply inputs into the production or development process. They can get away with it because that is the core assumption and everything else is secondary. So I've talked for about half an hour. I'll just start talking about the alternative very briefly. My argument in the book, The Global Development Crisis, in the last chapter, and now I'm writing the next one called The Struggle for Development, which I'll expand upon this. The alternative I argue is the idea of labour-centred development. This reverses the elite subject subordinate object conception of development and actually says, let us look at the actions of the poor, of labouring classes, to ameliorate their conditions. And it is in these collective actions that we do see real developmental gains taking place. We do see real ameliorations, real uplifting taking place. Not only that, but we also see a situation where the stark struggle for the imposition of the elite subject subordinate object framework in real material terms is waged, and it is resisted in developing situations. And so the first principle really of my argument, and it's a really basic thing, is to say that labouring class collective action can be developmental. But that's something that none of these previous frameworks like to admit. They usually talk about labouring class collective action, such as trade unions pushing up wages or getting better employment benefits, etc., as distortions to the market or interfering in state bureaucrats' ability to manipulate resources. So they see them as interferences. So what kind of examples can we look at to corroborate this argument? I mean, I'm writing about this now, but I'll just mention them very quickly. The shack dwellers movement in South Africa, Brazil's landless labourers movement, the collective actions by South Korean workers in the 1980s and contemporary Chinese industrial workers today, the Argentinian unemployed workers movement and the recuperated factory movements, the Nicaraguan revolution in the 1970s, the cordones industriales in Chile in the 1970s. And these are just some examples of where workers' collective actions, labouring class collective actions, have actually generated transformations in society, transformations in their own conditions for the better, and enable them not just to have a better material standard of living through access to land, access to employment and so on, but has actually changed their situation in the whole development process. They've begun to challenge the idea of the elite subject-subordinate object relationship. They have begun to take development into their own hands. They have begun to implement labour-centred development. Now, obviously, this is complicated and there are contradictions and limitations to all of these movements, but the point that they have been able to achieve some kind of development, I would argue, supports the first principle, the basic principle that collective actions by labouring classes can be developmental. And once you accept that, that has to be incorporated into the frameworks of the elite development theory. But they can't do it because that actually undermines the whole theoretical framework. So what they have to do is completely distort these movements, ignore them, undermine them, and completely distort the figures about poverty and inequality to show that they're doing the development work for the rest of us. All of these movements begin to show an alternative. There are more examples, but what can we, am I just talking about small-scale movements that exist for a few months or a couple of years? Actually, I think my argument is that the labour-centred development concept can go further and it can actually raise an idea of an alternative development process altogether, which destroys the elite development conception of the world. And what would be some of the principles of this alternative development? And these principles are not simply just parachuted by intellectuals upon these movements. I think these principles arise out of the actions of the movements themselves. Three principles, basically, would be democratic planning. So increase in, or the establishment of democracy in the economic sphere. Under capitalism, the whole trick of capitalism has been to trumpet its democratic legitimacy whilst carving out the economy from any kind of democratic control. The economy is closed off to any democratic influence, and these movements actually seek to input democracy into the economy. That is, they try to have, and they succeed in having somewhere or another, a democratic decision-making process about allocation of resources, production of resources, consumption of resources, things that are usually done by private capitalists and firms and corporations. Secondly, and part and parcel of this increase in economic democracy would be an end to capitalist property rights. The idea that a tiny minority of the world's population has the ability to purchase the labour power of the majority and then use that labour power in the ways that it sees fit is actually simply reproduces the elite subject-subordinate object relationship and reproduces a situation where you have the mass of the population living in oppressed conditions. So what we're talking about is new social property rights. I mean, there are many examples of this, and I mean, you can go back to even before capitalism when you had common property, which the level has fought for to some extent. Many examples that can be used to think about these new ways. And thirdly, I'd say this is the third complementary aspect, would be the idea of production for use rather than for profit. Now, at the moment, capitalist production is based upon achieving market share and producing for exchange value, that is, trying to produce in order to make a profit. But this leads to immense waste, overproduction, and it leads to the production of goods that actually are no good. And it leads to the production of things like cash crops in countries where there's not enough food for the population to eat. Production for use would be achieved through some more democratic control of the economy, and actually it would cut down waste. So what I'm talking about here is, if we think about democratic control of the economy and democratic planning, you can think about all of the overproduction that takes place under capitalism, all of the waste. You could actually factor increasing amounts of that out. And people who follow in the tradition of Friedrich Hayek say, oh, you can't interfere with the workings of the market. The market is made up by millions of individual actors who they know best how to allocate the limited resources they have. And if you have any overriding authority trying to allocate those resources, you will end up with suboptimal returns, and you'll end up with underdevelopment proceeding at pace, and you'll have the worst possible outcomes. Well, the reality is, if you look at firms and you look at intra-firm trade, and you look at the global value chains, and you look at the whole security nexus and the whole observation nexus that exists, the amount of planning that goes on between states and firms, within firms, between firms, is immense. Much higher than any kind of Soviet form of planning existed previously. So what we're saying is not that planning, it's planning or no planning. It's whether we have more or less democratic planning. Now, to finish off, you could say, yes, sounds great, but these are minority examples. Of course they are. Euro-utopian, yes. And so the best thing to do, actually, is to vote for those progressive governments like Lula or the Kirchners or whoever else, or Morales. Vote for the benign elites who will do the job better than we can do the job. Maybe, but that argument, I think, is based on a residual acceptance of the elite subject subordinate object approach. It really assumes that it is the elites who are better placed to direct resources than the masses, and it also assumes that the elites have the masses' interests at heart. What that kind of argument does, that we should trust the elites, what that argument hides is the fact that labour-centred development is a process that emerges through collective action. And actually, the elite subject-subordinate object approach to development is based upon denying that action, precluding that action, crushing that action. It's about stopping collective actions by labouring classes achieve their objectives. So it's not just about elites being nice and doing good things and allocating resources in a better rather than a worse way. It's also about the elites retaining their position as elites through delegitimating and destroying any opposition to them which would upset that elite subject-subordinate object framework of thinking and of action. And so when people say we should trust the elites and we should let them do the work and we should make policy for them, fine, you can make policy, but what you're also really saying is that the elites do have the legitimacy and the power, and they should have the legitimacy and power to stop the collective actions from below. Basically, at the end of the day, the labour-centred development approach is about forcing us to think about taking sides in the development process. Development is not simply an end goal, like the SDGs. It is not heaven being delivered in 15 years' time. Development is a struggle over the future nature of humanity, the future nature of society, and it's intensely conflictual. And what I'm trying to say is that if we take sides, we are actually in a much better vantage point to understand how development works than if we pretend that we're all in this together and that we can be nice like the SDGs says we should be. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. A lot of these movements have got internal contradictions, which everyone would expect. A lot of them get captured, a lot of them want to get captured. Absolutely. But they do try, and some of them do try and have policies that stop that happening. But the question of how do we implement it and what is our role? I mean, can you... We are not in those movements. We're not leading them. We are not the leading comrades at the front. What effect do we have? Sometimes we have more effect, strangely enough, on policymakers, or at least we can talk to them when we can't talk to these movements, because at least the policymakers are around. So, am I saying that we shouldn't talk to them or we should ignore them or anything like that? I think one of the arguments that I make in the paper is that progressive policy from above is often a product of these movements from below and the potential of those movements from below. And that has to be recognised. And so I'm not saying all policy from above is wrong. There is more benign and there's less benign policy from above, of course. But firstly, if you recognise that more progressive policy comes as a result of actions from below, you can still hold to this framework. And then you can start thinking about what it is that the movements need to do to stop themselves being co-opted. I mean, in the Brazilian situation, it's a disaster. The golden years of Lula now look not so shiny after all, and the movements were very quick to be co-opted because they saw this as their moment, and consequently the right-wing move of Dilma has compromised them further and further and really opened the door to the right. So it's not to say that they should not have voted for Lula in 2002 or 2001 and got him in, but it is to say that movements like the MST and others should have really, and CUT should have maintained independence and held to an alternative vision of development. In a way, I'm doing the typical academic thing of saying, if only you'd listen to me, if only you'd do what I think you should do, the world would be a better place. But I don't think I'm doing it in that arrogant sense. I'm saying, if you have an objective analysis of this situation, this is why these movements have been incapacitated, and this is why the negative move of many of these progressive regimes has been able to take place, not just because of falling commodity prices and so on. So, for example, in Brazil, what could have been done with rising commodities? Much more progressive taxes could have been levied upon the soya exporters and the iron ore exporters, for example. But for that to have happened, there would have had to be a big push from below to shift the governments against these sections of agrarian capital that it had been quite friendly to. So I'd say the first principle stands, but yes, I agree, it's not at all easy. First of all, I mean, the whole wage relationship is based upon segregation of men and women within the labour market, and so that's one gendering aspect. Secondly, you can look at the nature of the global working class now and see that the home workers are increasingly important in large parts of the world as a way of kind of cheapening the ability or making possible more middle-class sections of the population to go out to work. So there's this new kind of international dimension of gendered home working, which is very important. And I mean, there's lots of interesting work on that done. And I think also that a lot of people say, Marxists have to be careful about not falling into the productivist trap and just saying it's all about the capital-labour relationship in the factory. And I guess in my presentation, that's kind of where I was coming from. But I do try and not fall into that trap by thinking about it, that the capital-labour relation is not the only relation. And in fact, it could not exist if it was not for the social structure of accumulation that supports it. And that social structure is one that exploits and destroys nature and also controls very strongly women's reproductive rights and processes, and really segregates society into the men and women and genders society very strongly, and enables huge flows of free labour, basically, that's not captured through the capital wage labour relationship, huge amounts of free labour to be produced and then to flow into the productive sphere. I mean, the whole point about bringing up the next generation, and then that generation going to the United States or Australia to work where these countries don't even pay for their reproductive costs. I mean, all of that is actually, that's kind of this substructure, that's the supportive structure within which the capital-labour relationship is nourished again and again, and that's completely racialised as well. So I'd say that that would be part of my response. Well, I mean, I think the capital wage labour is central, but it's not the only thing, and it could not exist without a whole structure around it, and a whole supportive structure. So I'd say that's a kind of broad, you know, the idea of kind of a social reproductive regime is not just about the role of women in the family bringing up the next generation. It's also about society reproducing itself upon through destroying nature, through wrecking large parts of society, through gendering, through racializing. So I'm not sure, I don't feel I'm answering your question, but I mean, to me at least, I don't feel I'm stuck in that productivist trap because, well, I do think the capital wage labour relationship is central, but you can't just look at that, you have to understand it in its broader context. So we can talk about that after maybe. You can put me right. I'm sure I need to be put right on these issues. Well, first of all, I mean, the way the MST has been co-opted is in the sense that it has not been engaging in land occupations and land invasions, and those have gone down. But it still has its settlements, and it still has these education programs, and people like us in Brazil are very much involved in being invited and then being told by the MST, can you and will you teach us this, or talk to us about these things. So there is, the MST is still there and still engaging in very progressive actions. I mean, one example is a Nicaraguan revolution in the 1980s, which really contributed a lot to the development of large swathes of the population, much more so than the previous Somoza regimes. But the reason is, it's not that, okay, I don't know all examples of labour-centred development. If I was a big funder, and I was a progressive funder, of course I'd fund people like me to say, go and find all of these examples. But the reason there are not that many is not because of a lack of intellectual insight on people like our parts, or a lack of courage on the part of the labouring class movements. It's because of those examples have been co-opted and crushed by the elite developing project, the elite development project. So I don't see it as a problem when people say, oh, there's not many examples. Of course there are not. If there were so many examples, then we'd be living in a very different world. But what I can say is that more examples will appear in the future, and they are being fought over now. And in one way, this concept is about looking at latent possibilities and then seeing where they actually rise up and materialise. Yes, I mean, in the UK at the moment, we've got Jeremy Corbyn who's been elected. I voted. I didn't join the Labour Party, but I did pay £3 to be able to vote for him. So I was very pleased about that. And you know, he's talking about people's quantitative easing, and he's talking about why is it that billions and trillions are being pumped into the banks with not a zero impact on inflation, and yet the minute you get someone like Jeremy Corbyn saying, well, why not just direct this money to the poor populations in the world, in Britain and elsewhere, suddenly the mainstream economists start talking about inflation. That's complete hypocrisy on their part. So yes, politicians should, but they do actually. That's one of the myths, that the bankers have all the power. I mean, in Britain, for example, I don't know the situation here, but in Britain, the Treasury, the Bank of England and the City complex works very closely. And they love George Osborne and he loves them, and they work very well together. And they'd be terrified if Jeremy Corbyn got in, because he sees them for what they are. But I mean, this idea of the economic and the political, it's in a sense, it's a mirage. I mean, the economy is highly politicised, but we tend to think it's depoliticised in order to say, well, we can't have no effect on it, and we can only have an effect on the political sphere, and then only every 5 years. But yes, ideally, the whole monetary policy and economic policy should be much more openly political. Yeah, I mean, so for example, in South Korea during the 1980s, you had these huge mass strikes culminating in a shift towards a much more democratic society than previously, and they led to big increases in wages. I mean, I've got the data for that in my book. In contemporary China, you've got these big strikes continuing for the last 10, 15 years now, and they have led to some improvements in wages and conditions, but also in government policy, some would argue. So those examples are there. Then you can look at the MST example and see what is being done on this land that's being reclaimed, that was previously unused or underused and now is being fully used. What's being done now? I mean, that's the kind of data that I'd be looking at. I don't know if that's... I mean, I get the feeling that you're saying that kind of data would not be taken seriously by people in the World Bank because it's not quantitative enough or something like that, or not rigorous. Thanks. I mean, in terms of the second point, I mean, the welfare state in Europe was a major step forward, and as Quintin Hogg, he was this Tory politician, he became Lord Hailsham, he says, either we give them the masses social reform or they all give us revolution. So, social reform was delivered from above as a consequence of the mass movements from below that stretch back to 1917 and even before. So the point there is that progressive welfare states are not just dreamt up by benign people like us perhaps, but are shaped or even forced upon the state by movements from below. And the labour-centred development approach completely recognises that. It does not reject benign actions from above at all. It's not. I'm not a fundamentalist in that sense. In the sense of saying whatever they do for us, it can't be good. What have the Romans ever done for us? I'm not one of those types. Not at all. But a lot of the time, I mean, in the so for example, a pro-poor growth approach. People like the ODI and DFID, they talk about benign elites in China doing good things. But they never talk about how the mass movements in China have actually forced the benign elites to be benign. And that is just by admitting that, I think you open the door to a much richer understanding of the development process, a class-relational understanding of development, which gets around the kind of arrogance of a lot of these development thinkers and actors. I mean, when you go to development conferences, people are basically slapping themselves on the back for saying, these are the solutions, we are doing so well, and so on. And they're so elitist, they make me, they don't make you feel good and positive about the world. So I think just recognising that is important. And in terms of the NGOs, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the ones that I know is the Clean Clothes Campaign and the Asian Floor Alliance. They campaign absolutely for better wages, conditions, for a living wage. They propagandise in a good sense about the fact that so-called minimum wage is a poverty wage, the living wage is something like 4 times as much in a place like Cambodia. So absolutely, they are very, they are, if I had to say to students, and they say to me, I want to work for an NGO, which ones can I go and work for? I'd say NGOs like that. And there are many that do such good work. So I would say on those counts I'm not a fundamentalist. I'm fundamentalist in the sense of insisting that class relations are at the core of the development process and that collective actions by labouring classes in all their forms can be developmental. I mean, that is the kind of the core argument. But then that can lead in all kinds of directions. It can lead you to advocating all kinds of movements and struggles and policies. It doesn't fix you in one direction with one solution at all. Well, I mean, people say, you're an elite, or we're all part of an elite here. Because, well, I don't think so. I mean, for me, the elites are those who are in the state and those who control resources on a large scale, are basically large corporations and big state actors. And I don't have any control over resources in that sense. I've got control over my wage to an extent, but not really. I don't think of us as elites. And so these actors within the Clean Clothes Campaign, for example, I wouldn't call them elites. The elites for me are the ruling classes in old Marxist terminology. And that's where the problem lies. Not, we create all kinds of other problems. So this is the Why Nations Fail argument, for example, this book by Robinson and Asimoglu recently. Lots of people talk in those ways about what is it that over world history, what is it that defines successful nations against unsuccessful nations' attempts to develop? And their argument is that the elites in the now unsuccessful nations, a small bunch of elites have been able to concentrate wealth in their hands, whereas in the successful nations, you had responsive elites who've, rulers and corporations have been able to spread the wealth and deepen markets and so on. And this is what differentiates the US from, say, Russia, for example. That sounds very progressive. But for them, elites, again, it's very much in the kind of elite capture tradition of development, where you get these people dressed up in funny costumes, capturing decentralized power at the villages and destroying our good efforts to implement development. And in this broader case, you get unresponsive elites who are maybe the agrarian elites or rentier state actors who prevent resources from being spread around. But that way of characterizing elites, what that does is to denaturalize, is to naturalize and to depoliticize the real elites, who are the states and the corporations in these societies. So I'd say that there's some good stuff in this argument that growth is bad that inequality is bad for growth. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's got its limitations. And actually, I don't know if inequality is bad for growth. I mean, if you look at the emergence of capitalism, it could only form through massive inequality to start off with. Primitive accumulation, the real concentration of wealth, what Adam Smith called original accumulation. And the mistake of the modernisation Marxists today is to say we need to keep doing that. Like that quote I read out, we need to keep concentrating wealth in the hands of a few in order to then build up surpluses for them to invest and finally to have economic growth. So that's a partial answer again. Yeah, well, okay, so this comes back to 1906 and the Menshevik-Bolshevik split, and even further, and Marx saying I'm not a Marxist and all that. So, yeah, I mean, all of these are really, really good points. And just to start off with the first points about the prefigurative actions by the recovered factories. So I mean, like I point out in the book, and in something else I've written, these represent a major step forward in terms of kind of collective action and kind of democratic control over some parts of the economy in production, but not in circulation, not beyond the factory gates, not beyond the shop floor, as it were. And that imposes all kinds of limitations. And that then raises the question, do you go forward, do you step back, do you get incorporated? If you're getting incorporated, what do you do? I mean, it's not saying we can't operate with the state. There has to be some kind of interaction, but what is it going to be? Or maybe there shouldn't be an interaction, but that's where the argument has to take place. So I accept that there are all kinds of limitations. There are always contradictions and limitations to these movements. And yes, I mean, with the Korean strikes and so on, I mean, my colleague Kevin Gray writes about that, and he says one of his arguments, and people like Daeup Chang, I think they make this similar argument, is that one of the shifts in neoliberalism, towards neoliberalism in the 90s in South Korea was not the fact that more pressure from the World Bank and other big institutions, but it was actually a response by Korean elites and the chaebols to a number of things. One, the chaebols wanted more freedom from the state, but also a way of disciplining the working class after these massive decade of struggles was to shift to a more kind of free market-based way of doing things, that is, labour market deregulation. So, I mean, that's not to blame the workers for that, but that's to say every action gets a reaction, and that has to be a basic understanding of the labouring class movement, rather than thinking that gains once achieved can be always maintained. Because once you have that kind of mentality, then you end up swimming in smaller circles and becoming more reactionary. There's more and more trade union movements become, and Statist saying we want British jobs for British workers or Australian jobs for Australian workers and so on. So of course, is this not just classical Marxism, and I'm not just talking about a socialist revolution? Well, yes and no. Definitely I'm 100% informed by classical Marxism, by Marx and by Trotsky and other writers, absolutely. But is it just old-style classical Marxism? I think there's two aspects there. One is strategic. My audience, when I go to Marxist conferences and stuff, you hear a lot of very interesting stuff. You learn a lot more than you go when you do go to mainstream audiences. But, you know, people have got the answers there, and sometimes I think I haven't got much to say to people here because we all know what the answer is, and so on. But that's fine, because you get the same when you go to a World Bank kind of meeting. So the question is, who am I writing for, who am I speaking to? Basically, I see the audience, people I'm interacting with are people studying development, people who want to make the world a better place, who are genuinely interested in the uplifting and empowerment of the poor, and want to think about that. And what Marxism has done, Modernization Marxism in all its forms, has basically told them, don't be a Marxist, because we are just as bad as everyone else. We like Uncle Joe, we like Mao, we talk about repression and exploitation, we need more primitive accumulation, war is good for development. It really turns them off, plus the history of Stalinism, etc. So what I'm trying to do is use Marxist concepts and categories and the analysis that derives from them in order to understand development processes. I think that's a legitimate, it's not kind of Marxism by the back door, it's application of Marxism with a rejection of Modernization Marxism. But then in the question of, are we talking about socialist revolution or nothing, which is what it often comes down, I'm not saying you say that, but a lot of Marxists do. They sit there, they get to the auditorium or the lecture theatre or the seminar room, and they listen, and they realise within a few seconds this speaker is not going to talk about, and comrades, we need a socialist revolution. Therefore, I disagree with whatever he's saying, and he's wrong. He's a deviationist or whatever. I mean, that is a problem within Marxism. So the point is, you know, the successful Russian Revolution in 1917, the argument was by Trotsky and Lenin, it's not going to be successful unless you have other revolutions in the world. Let's say those other revolutions did take place. How long would it have taken for those revolutions to encompass the entire world, for there to be a socialist world system? We're not talking about a couple of years, we're talking about generations. And I think that in that situation, a socialist development strategy would have been necessary. And in all of these cases I talk about, some kind of idea about a socialist development strategy is necessary. That is, how do you have more progressive, grassroots, labour-centred development under capitalism and against capitalism whilst not getting destroyed at the same time? How do you not have a premature attack upon the state in order to and only be eliminated as a result? So what I'm trying to say is, I don't know if this is gradualism, but I think the idea of achieving gains and maintaining them and advancing them is an idea that is relevant. I mean, people, Michael Leibovitz, who I like very much, he wrote this brilliant book called Beyond Capital. He talks about encroachments upon the capitalist state and upon capitalism. And I don't think that's reformist, i.e. non-Marxist. I think that's very Marxist. It's to say that, you know, successful class struggles by labouring classes can actually wrest bits of society away from the control of capital and the state. More than that, they can actually shape the state's actions in more progressive ways. I mean, I use the idea of the strategic relational conception of the state by Bob Jessup, which I think is a Palanson way of thinking about the state. But that basically recognises that the balance of class forces has a major impact on how capitalist states organise in relation to labour. So all of these things, when you put them together, I think fit and mean that, you know, you can be in it for the long haul and you can have your ultimate objective as global socialism. And revolutions are certainly necessary, but in the medium term, what are you going to do? And organisation and parties and all that is absolutely part of the question, but also it's a question of how do you mobilise resources, how do you share them, how do you produce things, how do you consume in different ways? I suppose that's what I'm kind of looking at in terms of that aspect of the progressive society.
We'll call it quits. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thanks very much.
Really fascinating.
Thanks a lot.